In a town dying of drought, she stayed for the land. Then a lost farmer walked out of the dust. The sun hung high in the sky, baking the small town under its relentless heat. Every building, every road, and every piece of earth seemed to have turned a dull, dusty brown. The river that had once run through the center of town was nothing more than a cracked, dry bed. Farmers leaned on their fences, staring at the ground that no longer gave life. Shops stood half empty, and the air carried the constant whisper of despair. People were leaving. Wagon after wagon rolled down the only dusty road, carrying families away from the town that had once been full of life. Clara watched them go, her hands resting on the edge of her family's porch. She was in her late 20s, with the sun already darkening her skin from years of working outdoors. Her hair, usually tied back in a simple braid, now hung loose in the breeze that smelled of dust and dry earth. The town might have seemed empty to an outsider, but to her, every abandoned home, every empty field carried memories. This was her land, her family's land. She had inherited it after her parents had passed, and no matter how difficult the drought became, she could not leave. The land around her farm was cracked and thirsty. Her crops had struggled from the beginning of the season, and the soil had grown hard under the relentless sun. But Claire refused to give up. Each morning she rose before dawn, carrying buckets of water from a small well she had dug herself. She tended to the few plants that remained, moving slowly across the fields, feeling the warmth of the earth under her boots. Even in its suffering, the land felt alive to her. She remembered the way the fields had looked in her childhood, green and full, the sound of wind rustling through tall crops, the smell of fresh soil after rain. That memory kept her going. Clara spent her mornings repairing fences. Broken boards had become a constant problem as the dry wind swept through the town, loosening everything it touched. She hammered nails with steady hands, careful not to break any more of the weathered wood. Birds that had once sung in the early hours were gone, and the only sounds were the wind and the occasional creak of old boards. Yet even in this quiet, Clara felt the rhythm of life beneath the surface. She imagined the roots of her crops, deep under the earth, struggling to reach water, and she felt a quiet determination to help them survive. Nights were long, and the desert sky stretched endlessly above her. Stars shone bright and sharp, untouched by light pollution, and Clara would sit on the porch, letting the cool of the evening brush her face. She would think of her parents, of the laughter and work that had once filled this farm. The silence was heavy, but it was also comforting. In the stillness, she could hear her own heartbeat, feel her own strength. She spoke softly to herself sometimes, promising the land that she would not abandon it no matter how harsh the days became. Her neighbors had not been as strong. One by one, families had left, selling their homes or simply abandoning them. Clara had watched wagons rattle down the road, waving quietly to friends who had been more like family. Some had warned her to leave, telling her that the drought would claim everything if she stayed. But Clara could not imagine life anywhere else. The soil beneath her feet felt like home, the trees that still clung to life like old friends. She had grown up with the rhythm of planting and harvesting, the turning of seasons that now seemed frozen in an endless dry spell. To leave would be to turn her back on her family's legacy. The town council had begun meetings in the old community hall, discussions full of worry and frustration. Clara had attended a few, though she rarely spoke. The conversations centered on whether to sell the land to larger companies, whether to leave entirely, or whether the town could survive with so few people left. Most voices were filled with fear. She listened, quietly taking in the words, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought of the earth under her fingernails, the stubborn shoots of green that still clung to life despite the dryness. She thought of her parents' hands, rough with work but steady, and she decided then that she would stay. One morning Clara walked through the fields, her boots stirring up little clouds of dust with each step. She ran her hands over the soil, feeling the cracks in the dryness. The sun was hot, beating down on her shoulders, but she welcomed it. She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining rain falling softly, soaking the earth, filling the river beds and giving life back to the crops. In her heart, she believed that the land still had hope, even if the town around her seemed to have lost it. Her day was filled with simple tasks that were hard work under the sun. She carried water to the plants, patched fences, and repaired the roof of the barn before it caved in. Sweat dripped down her face, but she barely noticed. She moved with a purpose, as though every step she took was a promise to the earth itself. Even as the town emptied and the drought pressed harder, Clara refused to give in to despair. Sometimes she felt lonely. Nights were quiet, too quiet, and she would sit by the window, listening to the wind whistle through the empty streets. Memories of neighbors and friends filled her mind, and she wished they could see the land as she did, not just as dirt and dust, but as living soil full of memories and possibilities. She would imagine them returning, helping her work the fields, sharing stories and laughter once again. But even if they did not, she had made her choice. One evening after a long day of work, Clara sat on the porch, looking over the fields that stretched towards the horizon. The sky was a deep orange, fading to purple as the sun dipped lower. The wind carried a little dust, stirring the edges of the dry soil. She closed her eyes, listening to the faint sound of a bird in the distance, the only sound breaking the quiet. She breathed in the dry air, tasted it on her lips, and felt a strange kind of peace. She was alone, yes, but not defeated. The land had tested her patience, but it had not broken her spirit. Clara knew that the drought was far from over. She could see the challenges ahead, the long months of work, the uncertainty of whether crops would survive, the loneliness that pressed in at night. But she also knew something else. She belonged to this land as much as it belonged to her. And no storm, no drought, no empty town could take that away. That night, she went to bed early, her body tired, but her heart steady. She thought of her parents, of the fields in better days, and of the promise she had made to herself and the land. She would stay. She would work. She would survive. And maybe, just maybe, the land would survive with her. Little did she know that her life was about to change. In the days to come, someone would appear from the dust, a figure wandering through the empty fields, carrying loss and hope in equal measure. And Clara, who had learned to survive alone, would find herself connected to another soul, another story of resilience, as the fight to keep the land alive began in a way she could never have imagined. The next morning, Clara woke to the usual stillness of the town. The sky was pale, the sun rising slowly over the dry fields, and the wind carried the familiar scent of dust and cracked earth. She had planned another long day of work, repairing fences, checking the crops, and tending to the small patch of vegetables that stubbornly clung to life. But as she stepped out of her farmhouse, a movement on the horizon caught her eye. At first she thought it was a mirage, the heat bending the light across the land, but the figure grew clearer. It was a man, walking slowly and unevenly, his steps uncertain. Dust clung to his clothes and hair, giving him the appearance of someone who had been wandering through the dry plains for a long time. His hat was worn, his shirt torn in places, and his boots were coated in layers of dirt. Clara's heart skipped. She had seen travelers pass through the town, people leaving or returning briefly, but there was something different about this man. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than mere fatigue. He looked lost. Without hesitation, Clara grabbed a pitcher of water and a cup and started walking toward him. The distance between them seemed longer than it really was, the sun beating down and the dust swirling around her boots. As she approached, she could see his face more clearly. His eyes were hollow, shaded by the brim of his hat, and his cheeks were streaked with grime. There was a weariness in him, a weight of despair, but also a hint of determination. "Are you all right?" she called out, her voice firm but gentle. The man looked up slowly, blinking as if he had forgotten how to focus. He paused, then shook his head slightly, his lips dry and cracked. He did not speak at first. Clara could see the faint tremor in his hands, the way he leaned on an invisible support as he struggled to keep his balance. I think I'm lost, he finally said, his voice low and rough. I don't know where I am. You can rest there. I have water and food. Come inside." He hesitated, glancing at the empty fields behind him, the wide expanse of dusty plains stretching endlessly in all directions. The heat had burned into him, leaving him wary of any kind of comfort. But there was nowhere else to go. Slowly, carefully, he started walking toward her. Each step kicked up clouds of dust, and Clara could see how weak he was, how much the journey had taken out of him. When he reached her porch, Clara held out the cup of water. He took it with shaking hands, drinking slowly, carefully, as though the water might disappear if he drank too quickly. His lips were dry and chapped, his throat hoarse from thirst. But as he drank, color slowly returned to his face. "My name is Daniel," he said finally, setting the cup down on the porch rail. I was trying to find a place to survive. The drought, it took everything from me." Clara nodded, understanding more than he could know. She had watched her town shrink, her neighbors leave, and she had felt the same pressure of survival weighing on her. "I'm Clara," she said. "You're safe here for now. Rest, and then we can talk about what happened." Daniel sat on the porch leaning back against the railing, his body almost collapsing from exhaustion. He looked around at the cracked earth, the dry fields, and the empty town. "I've been walking for days, maybe weeks," he murmured. "I had a farm too, far to the west, but the sun and wind, they destroyed everything. I didn't know where to go." Clara listened quietly, offering small nods, letting him speak without interruption. She understood the weight of losing one's land, of feeling powerless against the relentless heat and dust. "You're not alone anymore," she said softly. "This land, it's hard, yes, but it's not impossible. I've stayed here, and I'll help you recover, at least for as long as you need." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment the exhaustion and despair in his eyes gave way to a spark of hope. You're still here?" he asked, almost in disbelief.
"Yes," Clara said firmly.
"I'm still here, and if you want, you can stay too. We can figure it out together." That afternoon, Clara brought him inside the farmhouse. The air inside smelled faintly of earth and old wood, and the cool shade was a relief from the sun outside. She offered him bread, a little cheese, and a small bowl of water. He ate slowly, almost mechanically, but with each bite he seemed to regain some of his strength. As Daniel rested, Clara went back outside to check the fields. She had learned to look at the land with patience. Even in the worst drought, there were signs of life if one knew where to look. She inspected the crops that were still growing, the stubborn shoots that poked through the cracked soil. Some would survive, some would not, but it was a start. When she returned to the porch, Daniel was awake, sitting quietly, his eyes following her every move. "You really stay here alone?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. Clara shrugged, wiping her hands on a cloth. "I could leave like everyone else," she said. "But I can't. This land, it's a part of me. It always has been. And giving up isn't an option. Not yet." Daniel nodded slowly as if her words were sinking in. He had been alone for so long, wandering from place to place, that the idea of staying seemed almost foreign. But there was something in Clara's determination, something unshakable and real, that made him believe there could be a place for him here. Over the next few days, Daniel began to recover. He helped Clara with small tasks around the farmhouse and fields. At first, it was just carrying water, repairing fences, and cleaning the porch. Each day he grew stronger, the spark in his eyes returning little by little. He and Clara worked in silence at times, the only sounds being the creak of wood, the rustle of dry grass, and the occasional call of a distant bird. In those quiet moments, Clara learned more about Daniel's past. He spoke of his own farm, the crops he had tried to grow, the failures and heartbreaks, and the journey he had taken to survive. He didn't speak of loss with anger, only with quiet resignation, as if he had accepted that the drought had taken what it wanted. Yet, in his eyes there was still a longing, a desire to rebuild, to find something worth fighting for again. Clara shared small stories, too, of her own struggles with the farm, of the nights she had spent worrying and hoping for rain, of the memories of her parents and the promise she had made to keep the land alive. They did not talk much about the emptiness of the town. Instead, they focused on what they could do, what they could save. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat on the porch together, watching the sky turn deep orange as the sun set behind the hills. The wind was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of earth that had absorbed the heat of the day. Daniel leaned back, letting the quiet settle around him. "I didn't think I'd find anyone who stayed," he said finally. Clara smiled faintly. "Sometimes staying is harder than leaving," she said. "But it's worth it. You'll see." They sat together in silence for a while, two people connected by shared hardship and the determination to survive. The drought had brought despair, but it had also brought them together. In the midst of dust and heat, there was a small spark of hope growing quietly, waiting for the rain to nurture it. As night fell, Daniel settled into a small room in the farmhouse. He had walked out of the dust and into a place where survival was possible again. Clara closed the door behind him, feeling a strange sense of relief. He was still a stranger, still someone with his own burdens, but there was a connection now, a shared understanding of the land, the hardship, and the will to keep going. And in that quiet farmhouse, under the wide star-filled sky, Clara realized that the drought had not only tested her, but had brought someone into her life who could share the fight, someone who could help her keep the land alive. The journey ahead would be long, the work exhausting, but for the first time in many months, she did not feel completely alone. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the dry plains, painting the cracked earth with pale gold. Clara stepped outside, feeling the familiar heat on her shoulders. The fields looked exactly as they had the day before, dry, cracked, and stubbornly resisting life. But she did not despair. Today she was not alone. Daniel was already up, carrying buckets of water from the well, moving carefully across the dusty ground. "Morning," Clara called, her voice carrying across the field. Daniel nodded, giving a small smile. "Morning," he replied, his voice hoarse but stronger than the day he arrived. They began their work immediately. The sun was harsh, but there was a rhythm to it that Clara had grown to love. They started with the irrigation channels, old ditches carved into the earth long ago to bring water to the crops. Most were blocked by dry debris or had crumbled in places. Clara handed Daniel a shovel, and together they began digging, clearing and redirecting the water to the plants that still clung to life. As they worked, the dust rose around them in little clouds swirling in the wind. Clara wiped sweat from her forehead and glanced at Daniel. His hands were rough, calloused from work, but they moved with the determination. He had strength, she realized, but also patience. He didn't rush, didn't complain, only kept working as the hours passed. By midday, their clothes were soaked with sweat and dust clung to their skin. They paused under the shade of the barn, drinking water and resting. Daniel leaned against the post, breathing heavily, and Clara handed him a small loaf of bread. "You've been walking a long time before you found this place," Clara said softly. Daniel nodded, taking a bite of the bread. "Weeks. Maybe more. I lost track of time. The sun, the wind, it wears you down. I didn't know if I would find anyone. I didn't know if I would find a farm that could survive this." Clara listened, understanding his words better than he knew. She had stayed through the drought when everyone else had left, and she had felt the same uncertainty in her own heart. "It's not easy," she said. "But there is still hope. Some plants will survive. Some soil still holds life. You just have to keep working." Daniel looked at her, admiration in his eyes. "You stayed all this time?" "Yes," Clara said. "Even when it was hard, even when the town was empty, I stayed. The land needs someone. And I can't leave it." The two returned to work, moving to the smaller patches of crops. They worked side by side, digging, watering, and clearing debris. Clara showed Daniel where the stubborn plants had roots deep enough to survive the heat, where the soil was softer, and where a small amount of water could make the most difference. He followed her guidance carefully, learning quickly. Hours passed and the sun climbed higher. The fields were exhausting, but there was satisfaction in the labor.
Each small patch they saved, each tiny shoot that survived, felt like a victory.
The drought was still merciless, but together they were making a difference. By late afternoon, Clara and Daniel paused again, sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the field. Their clothes were dusty and torn, their hands scraped and dry, but there was a sense of accomplishment. Daniel looked over the fields, the sun casting long shadows behind him. "You really know this land," he said quietly. "Even in the worst conditions, you see the life that's left." Clara smiled faintly. "It's not easy. You have to look closely. You have to pay attention to the smallest signs, the green shoots, the texture of the soil, the roots that still hold water. If you give up too early, you miss it." Daniel nodded, thinking of his own farm far away, lost to drought and misfortune. He realized that Clara's determination was something he had never known before. Most people had left, but she had stayed, finding life in the barren soil. And now, working with her, he could see a path forward, even if it was hard and uncertain. Over the next few days, their work continued. They repaired fences that had begun to collapse, dug deeper irrigation channels, and carefully tended to the crops that survived. Each day brought challenges. The sun burned hotter, the wind carried more dust, and the soil became harder, but Daniel and Clara faced it together. They learned to anticipate each other's movements in the fields, passing tools without words, communicating with glances and gestures. There was a rhythm to their work, a silent cooperation born of necessity. Clara showed Daniel how to move efficiently, how to dig without breaking the soil, and how to water the plants in a way that preserved every drop. Daniel in turn shared his knowledge of different crops, techniques he had used on his own farm, ideas that could help save some of the harder-to-grow plants. Evenings were the quietest part of the day. They would sit on the porch, sharing small meals and talking in low voices. Daniel told stories of his family and his farm, the fields he had once cultivated, and the seasons that had shaped his life. Clara shared memories of her childhood on this land, of the harvests, the laughter, and the long days spent learning to care for the soil. Through these stories, trust grew. They were no longer strangers, merely two people surviving the drought. They were partners, connected by the shared work of saving a piece of the land that mattered deeply to both of them. One evening, after a particularly long day, a dust storm rolled across the plains. The wind howled, carrying fine particles that stung their skin and made it difficult to see. They huddled inside the barn, holding on to each other briefly as the storm passed, feeling the raw power of nature. When it ended, the fields looked even harsher, the soil more cracked, and the small plants they had nurtured barely visible. But Clara refused to give in. "We can do this," she said, determination in her voice. "The storm can't take everything. We'll keep going." Daniel looked at her, admiration in his eyes. "I've never met anyone like you," he said. "Most people would have left long ago, but you fight. You don't give up." Clara smiled faintly. "You fight because it matters. You don't give up because the land is worth it. You can't give up on something you love." The next morning they were back in the fields, working from sunrise to sunset. They experimented with different methods to conserve water, trying small trenches, covering soil with straw, and planting crops closer together to preserve moisture. It was exhausting, but the shared effort created a bond that went deeper than words. Daniel began to understand the rhythm of Clara's work, the careful attention she paid to each plant, each section of soil. He respected her deeply, not only for her knowledge and skill, but for her unwavering commitment to the land. Clara, in turn, saw in Daniel a man who had been broken by misfortune yet was willing to learn, to adapt, and to work with her toward a common goal. As the days passed, small signs of life began to return. Tiny shoots of green appeared in the cracked soil, and the stubborn plants they had nurtured showed resilience. Each success, no matter how small, was celebrated. They shared quiet smiles, brief laughter, and moments of pride as they watched life return to the land they both loved. Even though the drought still pressed down on the town and the fields were far from fully recovered, Clara and Daniel had built something stronger than hope alone. They had built trust, partnership, and a shared determination that neither had known before. By the end of Part 3, the land remained harsh, the town still quiet, and the drought unrelenting. But Clara and Daniel had begun to change that. They were no longer fighting alone. They had each other, and together, they could face the challenges ahead, one step at a time, one patch of soil at a time. Days passed, each one long and tiring under the relentless sun. Clara and Daniel woke with the first light, their bodies stiff from the previous day's labor. Yet the fields demanded attention. The drought had not eased, and the soil remained dry and cracked, but there were signs of life pushing stubbornly through. Green shoots peeked up in small clusters, and each new sprout became a small victory, a quiet reassurance that the land still had hope. Clara moved through the fields with careful precision, her hands brushing against the hardened soil, feeling for roots that still held water beneath the surface. Daniel followed, carrying buckets of water and tools, his gaze scanning the horizon for any signs of further damage from the sun or wind. The work was exhausting, yet the rhythm of labor was comforting. It gave structure to their days and purpose to their efforts. One morning, as the sun rose in a pale orange glow, Clara noticed Daniel standing still, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes distant. She paused her work and walked over to him. "You've been quiet?" she said gently. "Are you all right?" Daniel looked at her and sighed, a sound that carried months of weariness. "I'm fine," he said finally, but the truth in his voice was unmistakable. "It's just hard to believe that anything can survive out here sometimes. I've seen too much dry land, too many failed crops. It gets in your mind, makes you doubt everything." Clara nodded, understanding completely. She had felt the same doubt herself many times over. "I know," she said softly. "I feel it too. But every time a shoot survives, every time the soil holds water, it reminds us why we keep going. It reminds us there is hope, even in the worst conditions." They continued their work together, but the air between them was softer now, more personal. They spoke in quieter tones, sharing small stories and memories as they moved across the fields. Daniel told Clara about the farm he had lost, the seasons that had shaped him and the crops he had fought to grow before the drought stole them. Clara spoke of her childhood on this land, of the laughter of her parents, and the small lessons she had learned about patience and resilience. It was in these moments, away from the harsh sun and the relentless wind, that they began to see each other in a new light. Daniel admired Clara's unwavering determination, the way she could look at barren soil and still see life. Clara saw in Daniel a quiet strength, a man who had faced loss and hardship yet was willing to learn, to work, and to fight alongside her. Evenings became a time for reflection. After long days in the fields, they would sit on the porch of the farmhouse, the sun sinking behind the distant hills and casting the land in shades of orange and purple. The wind was cooler now, carrying with it the faint smell of earth that had absorbed the day's heat. They would share small meals, eat bread and cheese, and talk quietly as the sky darkened and stars began to appear. One evening, Daniel broke the comfortable silence. "Do you ever feel lonely?" he asked, his voice soft. Clara thought for a moment, watching the wind stir the dry grass in the fields. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I have the land, and it keeps me company. It's not the same as people, but it has a rhythm, a presence. And now?"
"I have you too. That makes it easier."
Daniel nodded, a small smile forming on his face. "I didn't think I would find anyone here," he said. "I've been walking alone for so long. Meeting you, it's like finding a place I can belong again." Clara smiled faintly. "You belong here," she said. "If you want to stay, you have a place. And together, maybe we can make this land live again." Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. In the fields, they worked side by side, moving in a silent rhythm that only comes from trust and understanding. Daniel learned to anticipate Clara's movements, passing tools without words, adjusting to her pace. Clara, in turn, respected Daniel's suggestions and ideas, his experience from his own farm, adding new insight to their efforts. They began to experiment with new methods to help the soil retain moisture. They dug small trenches, covered the ground with straw to prevent evaporation, and planted crops closer together to preserve water. It was painstaking work, but the shared effort made the long days bearable. And each tiny success, a plant that survived, a patch of soil that held water, was celebrated quietly with a smile or a nod. One afternoon, as they rested beneath the shade of the barn, Clara noticed Daniel staring at the horizon. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Daniel shrugged. "Just imagining how the land could look if we managed to save it. Even a little. Green fields, healthy crops, life returning to this town." Clara's heart lifted. "It's possible," she said. "We've already made progress. It won't be easy, but it's possible." Daniel smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I'm glad I found you," he said quietly. "I don't think I could have survived this place alone." The days of solitude, the long nights spent worrying about the land had been heavy. Now, with Daniel by her side, the burden felt lighter. They were not just surviving, they were building something together, a partnership born of necessity but strengthened by shared purpose. The town, though still quiet, began to notice their efforts. A few neighbors who had stayed behind glanced at the two of them working in the fields, whispering to each other about the determination they saw. Clara and Daniel did not seek attention, but the small acts of care and persistence were visible. Fences repaired, small crops surviving, water channels restored. These were signs that life could endure, even in the harshest conditions. One evening, as the wind carried dust across the fields, Daniel and Clara sat quietly on the porch, watching the sky turn deep red. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked softly. Clara shook her head. "No, leaving would mean giving up on everything. This land, it's a part of me, and it needs someone who believes in it, even when it's hard. That's why I stay." Daniel reached out and lightly touched her hand, a gesture of connection that neither of them had spoken about before. "I think I understand now," he said. "There's more to staying than just surviving. It's about hope. And you have hope in your heart." Clara looked at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. They were both survivors, both shaped by loss and hardship, but together they had begun to see possibilities where before there had been only despair. The nights were long, and sometimes sleep came fitfully, with dreams of dry fields and cracked soil, but the days brought a new kind of energy. They continued their work with determination, helping each other carry heavy buckets of water, repair fences, and nurture the stubborn plants that refused to die. Each task, no matter how small, was a step toward recovery, a step toward hope. The morning air was cooler than usual, carrying a faint scent of moisture that Clara had not smelled in months. She stepped outside and felt a small thrill of hope stir in her chest. The sky, once pale and unchanging, was now dotted with heavy clouds, gray and low, as if the heavens themselves were preparing to offer relief. Clara's heart quickened. Rain was coming, and with it a chance for life to return to the land she had fought so hard to protect. Daniel was already outside carrying buckets of water to the young crops, checking the irrigation channels. He looked up at the clouds and smiled faintly. "I think it might actually rain today," he said, his voice full of cautious excitement. "It's been so long, I almost forgot how it felt." Clara nodded, letting herself feel the hope that had been building quietly inside her. The clouds moved slowly, almost reluctantly, but their presence was enough to lift the weight that had pressed down on her for so long. "It's time to be ready," she said. "We need to make sure the water reaches every plant, every patch that survived." They cleared debris from the channels, dug small trenches to guide the water, and checked the fragile crops that had managed to survive. Each movement was precise, efficient, born of weeks of practice and shared effort. The rhythm of their work was soothing, and for the first time in a long while, Clara felt like the land itself was breathing with them, waiting for the rain to return. As the first drops began to fall, Daniel and Clara paused, looking up at the sky. The rain was light at first, a gentle patter against the dry soil, and yet it carried a promise of life. The scent of wet earth rose around them, filling their senses with a richness they had not experienced in months. Clara closed her eyes, letting the droplets fall on her face, and felt a deep sense of relief. "This is what we've been waiting for," she whispered. "This is what makes it all worth it." Daniel nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. "We did it," he said quietly. "We kept the land alive, at least enough for this to happen. And now, it's starting to come back." They worked in the rain, carrying buckets and checking the small plants that had begun to sprout. The water seeped into the soil, softening it, reviving it. Tiny shoots, once barely visible, began to stretch toward the sky. The dry earth drank greedily, and Clara could see life returning in small but definite ways. As the rain continued, a few neighbors who had stayed behind began to notice the movement on the fields. Some watched from their porches, others from the edges of the town, whispering quietly to one another. Clara and Daniel paid them little mind, focused on the work, but they could feel the change in the atmosphere. The drought still held power, but the sight of life returning was contagious. People began to hope again. By midday, the rain had strengthened, falling steadily, washing away layers of dust and warming the earth. Clara and Daniel paused beneath the barn for a moment, letting the water soak them through, feeling a sense of accomplishment unlike anything they had known before. The fields, once barren and lifeless, now glistened with moisture, and the small patches of green seemed to glow against the brown soil. Daniel looked at Clara, his expression serious but filled with gratitude. "I never thought I'd see this again," he said.
"I never thought I'd find hope. But you
stayed. You believed. And now it's coming back." Clara smiled, her face wet with rain and sweat. "We both stayed," she said softly. "We both worked for this. And it's not over yet. There's still much to do, but this is a start." As the rain continued to fall, they began to move more slowly through the fields, tending to the crops with care, making sure the water reached every root. Each plant that survived became a symbol of their perseverance, a quiet proof that life could endure even the harshest conditions. In the evening, the storm began to ease, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a town transformed. The streets, once dusty and empty, now glistened with wet earth. The air smelled rich and sweet, full of possibility. Clara and Daniel stood on the porch, looking out over the fields, their bodies tired, but their hearts full. "You know," Daniel said quietly, "the town seems different today. People are noticing. They're seeing that maybe this place isn't finished yet." Clara nodded. "They'll see. It takes time, but if we keep working, others will come back. Life doesn't have to leave this town. Not if we help it." Over the next few days, the rain continued in gentle showers. The land responded quickly. Plants that had been struggling began to grow taller, their leaves greener and stronger. The irrigation channels, once dry and cracked, now carried water steadily, reaching the areas that had been hardest hit. Clara and Daniel worked tirelessly, sometimes from sunrise to sunset, sometimes through the cooler hours of evening, tending to the revived land with care. The town slowly began to change as well. A few neighbors returned, inspired by what Clara and Daniel had accomplished. They brought tools, seeds, and ideas, joining in the effort to restore the farms and homes that had been abandoned. The quiet streets were no longer completely empty, and the sense of community began to return. Clara watched as families moved back into their homes, children running through the streets and laughter echoing across the town. It was a sight she had not seen for months, and it filled her with joy. Daniel stood beside her, sharing the moment, and she felt a deep sense of connection, not only to him but to the town itself. Evenings became times of reflection and planning. Clara and Daniel would sit on the porch watching the sunset over the fields, discussing what needed to be done next. They spoke of planting new crops, reinforcing fences, and helping neighbors recover their land. The work was far from over, but the hope that had returned to the town carried them forward. One evening, Daniel turned to Clara, his expression soft. "You know, I never imagined I would find a place like this," he said. "A farm that's still alive, a town that can come back, and someone to share it with. I'm glad I found you." Clara felt warmth in her chest, a sense of belonging that she had not realized she was missing.
I'm glad you stayed, she said simply.
This land had brought us together, and now we can help it grow stronger than ever. As the weeks passed, the town continued to recover. Crops flourished, fences were repaired, and the streets were no longer silent. Clara and Daniel worked together tirelessly, their bond deepening with each shared effort. They had faced the worst of the drought and emerged stronger, their connection to each other and the land unbroken. By the end of the season, the fields were a patchwork of green and brown, a testament to survival and perseverance. Clara walked through the rows of crops, feeling the soil beneath her fingers, and smiled. Daniel followed, carrying water, tending to the plants, and sharing in the quiet victories of the day. The town was not fully restored, and the drought was not completely over, but there was hope. Life had returned, slowly but surely, and the people who remained were ready to face whatever challenges came next. Clara and Daniel stood together on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the fields.
"We did it," Daniel said quietly, almost to himself.
"No," Clara said, smiling. "We didn't do it alone. The land, the town, and all of us together did it. And we'll keep doing it, one day at a time." The wind stirred the leaves of the trees, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked earth. The town, once dying under the relentless sun, had begun to live again. And Clara and Daniel, two people brought together by the harshest of circumstances, had found a home, a purpose in each other. The future was still uncertain, but as they stood together, hands in the soil and hearts full of hope, they knew one thing for certain: life could endure, even in the driest dust, when people refused to give up, and together they would keep the land alive and the town alive for years to come.